Hey folks, and welcome to our first video on the film art movement known as German Expressionism. German Expressionism usually refers to an art movement that consists of several related creative movements in Germany before World War I that reached a peak in Berlin in the 1920s. One of the most important aspects of German Expressionism as a general artistic movement in Germany is, of course, its contribution to cinema. These developments were part of the larger Expressionist movement in North and Central European culture across the arts, in architecture, dance, painting, and sculpture. So to begin to understand German Expressionism as a film movement, we need to understand the general idea of Expressionism. What is Expressionism, and what do we mean when we say Expressionism? The typical trait of Expressionism is to present the world solely from a subjective perspective, distorting it radically for emotional effect in order to evoke a kind of mood. The key word here, I think, is emotion. There are many kinds of artistic movements that depart from the depiction of reality, but Expressionism is a way of departing from reality that invokes a particular feeling or emotion, usually as it's related to human beings within a world. And the film critic and scholar Lottie Eisner, in her book, The Haunted Screen, perhaps the most famous and most widely read book on the German Expressionist movement in cinema, echoes this idea. She says, the Expressionist does not see, he has visions. Only the interior vision he provokes exists. So once again, that idea that Expressionism is all about taking some kind of interior feeling and putting it out into the world. And I think we can detect the essence of the idea if we just look at the word express. Express comes from the Latin pressare, to press, and the prefix ex, which means out. So to express etymologically means to press out, to obtain by squeezing, to get that which is inside of something out. Think about expressing a sponge, squeezing it so that the water gushes out. Expressionism takes emotions or feelings that are within us and pushes them out into the world so that they're visible. So I think this logic of Expressionism is made really clear if we look at a famous Expressionist painting. This isn't a German painting. This is a Norwegian painting by the artist Edvard Munch called The Scream. You've probably seen it before. So what makes this painting expressionist? The first thing that I think we might notice is the human figure. The human figure does not look realistic. It's not rendered realistically. It looks like an exaggerated caricature of a human being. Notice the elongated skull and the way that the hands placed upon the sides of the face perfectly conform in line and curve to the sides of the face. Notice that this exaggerated, unrealistic drawing style conveys a heightened, exaggerated emotion, that of terror or anxiety or fear. But the human figure alone wouldn't make this painting expressionist. What really marks the painting as an expressionist work is the relationship between the human figure and their environment. So notice the way that the background is painted sort of grows out of the lines of the human figure itself. You can see the curve of the head and the hand on the right side of the human figure's body seems to emanate out into those lines of the landscape behind them. Human figure and environment are perfectly in sync. And it's almost as if the emotions in the human figure are spilling out into the depiction of the world beyond them. And notice also the way that the lines that seem to emanate from the right side of the human figure continue on to fill out the rest of the painting, especially the background. What's also been noted quite a bit with this painting is the use of color. The sky is made up of these stark reds and oranges. Perhaps they might convey the colors that are typical of a sunset, but they do seem exaggerated, oversaturated, strange, and warped. And you also might note that the figure in the center is not the only human figure in the painting. On the bridge in which the human figure is standing are these two other figures who are barely rendered and who don't seem to share the turmoil of the main character. They just seem to be ordinarily walking in the same space. So whatever is affecting our main character doesn't seem to be affecting the people around him. making the main figure feel as if his suffering is alone, that his suffering is only by himself. And this sort of reinforces this central feeling that this painting is said to give us. The overall impression that you get is one of terror and anxiety. And the painting has become a kind of universal symbol of anxiety in general. So how do we kind of distill the essence of Expressionism? Well, another way of doing that is to compare Expressionism to a contemporaneous art movement. So if Expressionism is associated with an emphasis on subjective feeling, especially feelings of anxiety and fear, is not usually marked by a kind of negative or dark tone. Really, the Impressionists were largely concerned with an emphasis on an accurate depiction of light, especially in its changing qualities, like with the passage of time and motion that you'll get with one of these haystack paintings from Monet in 1890. While both of these paintings might be said to have that similar style of visible brushstrokes, that is a major departure from, say, academic painting in the 18th century that strives for a kind of perfect illusionism, what distinguishes the Expressionist painting from the Impressionist painting is a logic of how depiction is connected with subjectivity of a character or of a human figure. So once again, if you look at another notable Expressionist painting, that of Knight Errant by Oskar Kokoschka from 1915, you'll again see those visible brushstrokes that you might want to associate with Impressionism, but notice the exaggeratedness of the way this is depicted, the extreme colors that don't at all correspond with an objective reality, the contorted body of the human figure, the background that almost seems to give us a kind of storm, or lines that suggest a kind of otherworldly intensity. And then compare this to an Impressionist painting, once again from Monet. You get those visible brushstrokes, but they're not put in the service of representing an interior turmoil. In fact, the basic relations between human figures and their environments is rather realistic. So how do we get from Expressionism to the topic of this lecture, which is German Expressionist cinema? German Expressionist cinema usually refers to major German films made between 1919 and 1926. You can generally think of the long 1920s as being the time for German Expressionist cinema. I want to start with a little bit of history. There were a number of factors that led to this art movement in Germany in the 1920s. One of them, of course, was that in 1916, Germany banned all foreign films, leading to increased domestic filmmaking. So during World War I, Germany was making up for the fact that it banned foreign films by largely increasing production. A lot more movies were being made. After 1916 than in the years before. So that allowed a lot of filmmakers the chance to experiment and, in a sense, to compete with Hollywood filmmaking. And one of the main ways to compete with Hollywood filmmaking is to offer something that Hollywood doesn't do. German Expressionism is largely an avant-garde, or in some sense a modernist film movement that goes against the Hollywood conventions that were already established in the 19-teens. And of course, the major event that's going to stimulate the mindset of the German Expressionist filmmaker is the horror of World War I. From 1919 to 1926, Germany was in social and economic disarray after World War I, after losing the war. German Expressionism is a movement that's associated with darkness, with anxiety, with a suspicion of power and authority, and you can see that as a result of what happened in World War I. Lottie Eisner echoes this in her book, The Haunted Screen. She says, the years immediately following the First World War were strange ones in Germany. The German mind had difficulty in adjusting itself to the collapse of the imperial dream, and inflation could not be stopped. What she's referring to here, of course, is the staggering inflation of German currency. She says the material conditions which resulted led to a general decline of values, and the inner disquiet of the nation took on truly gigantic proportions. So even though I think it's a bit facile and reductive to say that the aesthetic of German Expressionism is directly tied to the suffering, the loss, and the instability of post-World War I Germany, I do think it's probably the most important connection between aesthetics and history when we're talking about German Expressionism. So what are the aesthetic characteristics of German Expressionism? And I do want to spend a little bit more time here. Probably the most notable characteristic of German Expressionism is distorted, exaggerated, and unrealistic mise-en-scène. That means set design, lighting, costume, makeup. That is understood to express interior states of characters. The most famous and notable German Expressionist film that illustrates this, which we'll talk about more in depth in another video, is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Wiene from 1920. So to give a simple example of that exaggerated set design, we need to look no further than this particular image, which shows how the set designers of this particular film would not only make exaggerated geometric sets that didn't correspond to actual architecture in the world, but they would also go so far as to paint shadows and lights onto the sets itself. So we have a street lamp here in this exaggerated geometric set design, but underneath it you can actually see this kind of star pattern that represents, not in an illusionistic way, but an expressive way, the light cast on the floor. Lottie Eisner will talk about her own favorite example of the set design of Caligari in this moment. She talks about this moment in the film where we look at a prison cell. She says the abstraction and the total distortion of the Caligari sets are seen at their most extreme in the vision of the prison cell, with its verticals narrowing as they rise like arrowheads. The oppressive effect is heightened by these verticals being extended along the floor and directed at the spot where the chain-laden prisoner squats. In this hell, the distorted rhomboid window is a mockery. The designers succeeded in rendering the idea of a jail in the absolute in its most expressive expression. So I think this is a great description of what the effect of these set designs are. In a sense, what she's saying here is that Expressionism doesn't just distort for the sake of distortion. It distorts in order to enhance a particular mood or feeling. In the sense, in this particular shot, the set design is warping the traditional look of a jail cell in order to emphasize the feeling of being confined and oppressed. All of the lines kind of tower over the figure in the center. The lines create shapes that have sharp points. And the window at the top, she calls a mockery. That is a mockery of an actual window that would serve the purpose of giving a view to the outside world. All of these things create what she calls a jail in the absolute. A jail cell that exaggerates the feeling of being confined and restricted and oppressed. So where else can we see these exaggerated set designs? So you can see similar, even more exaggerated set designs in a film like From Morn to Midnight from 1920, seen here. And you can see a different kinds of exaggeration in the film The Golem, How He Came into the World, also from 1920. Notice that what constitutes an exaggerated set design is going to be different across many German Expressionist films. The set design of The Golem is not exactly geometric and abstract, but it is exaggerated and warped and evocative of a mood. Lottie Eisner will continue her discussion of the set design of German Expressionism, and she'll do something which I think is really useful for homing in on what is particular about German Expressionist cinema. So she'll say, when Abel Gance, a French filmmaker, had made his own attempt at filming a world seen through the eyes of a madman, he had gone about it in quite a different way. In his film La Folie, knowing nothing of anamorphic lenses, he borrowed several concave and convex mirrors from a hall of mirrors in a nearby amusement park and filmed the reflections of people and objects, occasionally obtaining mere blobs and wavy lines. This, she says, was a fundamentally impressionistic use of the camera. The distortions of Dr. Caligari, however, lie in the basic graphic idea and can therefore be termed expressionistic. So I think this distinction is quite useful, even if the passage isn't quite making it clear. Distorting an image to reflect the subjective perception of a character is not exactly what makes something expressionistic. German Expressionist films are not simply using camera techniques to evoke the momentary subjective experience of a character. Rather, the entire world of a German Expressionist film feels inflected with the moods of characters, with a kind of dark and somber, anxious mood. That, I think, is one of the essences of German Expressionism. It's how subjectivity is placed into the world. Okay, let's get back to some of the visual markers of German Expressionism. Another one is emphasis on shadows and silhouettes, and in general, high contrast imagery. You can see that in the image from Caligari that I have here to your right, and you can see this use of shadows in this moment from Caligari. The film, very briefly, is about a hypnotist named Dr. Caligari, and he has his subject named Cesare, who he hypnotizes in order to command to kill various people within the village. And in the first murder, we see it through shadow. In cinema, this now seems like a kind of cliche, but it's a cliche because it was established by these films in Germany from the 1920s. We can see similar kinds of shots from Nosferatu by F.W. Murnau, which is the first surviving filmic adaptation of the novel Dracula by Bram Stoker. In the same film, we can actually see this moment where the shadow of Nosferatu's hand clutches at the heart of his victim, and the shadow has actual material consequences. A third characteristic of German Expressionist cinema is a kind of vague aesthetic sensibility where characters seem to merge with the setting. We already talked about the way that in The Scream, one of the notable aesthetic features is that the human figure seems to aesthetically merge with the setting, as if the lines that form the figure bleed out into the background. We can see a similar kind of thing in this bit of illustration for a poster for A Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Notice the way in which the female figure blends into the environment, how the contours of her body that go from her shoulders to her waist to her feet perfectly recreate the converging lines of perspective that form the pathway that she's on. In an almost abstract and geometric way, the lines that make up her body conform to the lines that make up the environment behind her. And these very careful and deliberate relations between human figures and their environments can be seen throughout Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This is the scene in which Caligari's hypnotized subject is going to murder the woman that our protagonist loves. This is the first shot that we see in which he is emerging outside of her window. Notice a few things here. First, we have an iris effect that emphasizes sharp angles. But then you'll notice that those sharp angles, especially the motif of acute triangles that point down, can be seen on the left and the right side of the screen. And now consider that when we take a wider view, above those two ornaments that we saw earlier are much larger and more menacing triangles that now come to take on the look of a blade pointing downward. And wonderfully, right in between those two blades is Cesare himself, who was walking in such a way, one foot in front of the other, as if to make his own body a pointed blade. Notice how tight and stilted his movement is, such that black silhouette of his body forms a very similar shape to the blade-like shapes on his left and right. Lottie Eisner will in fact note that one of the hallmarks of German Expressionist cinema is a certain kind of performance style. She says, through a reduction of gesture, the actors attain movements which are almost linear and which remain brusque, like the broken angles of the sets, which I think is perfectly illustrated here. And then finally note that the kind of graphic payoff of this entire sequence is made when Cesare takes out his knife and lifts it above his head so that we can see how it perfectly echoes the motif of those blade-like shapes that we saw earlier. It's almost as if every little detail of the set, including the actor's performance, portends the violence of the action in this sequence. The violence tied to the very shape of the murder weapon, the knife. You can see similar moments where performance style and gesture correspond with the environment, such as here when Cesare's strange posture and gesture, which seems otherworldly, unnatural, stilted, robotic, seems to quite deliberately mimic the shape of the exaggerated trees in the set. And to see how this is executed in another German Expressionist film by the same filmmaker, Genuine from 1920 by Robert Wiene, notice here how the posture of the woman on the left perfectly corresponds with the lines behind her. She holds this posture in one sense to evoke the distance that she's creating with the male figure on the right. Right, and both of them kind of hold their bodies at angles to reflect his pursuit and her retreat. But also notice how the lines in the background wall seem to spill out from her gesture. And the final thing that I want to note about the characteristics of German Expressionism is a kind of dark and moody narrative and tone. If you just look at a cluster of the most exemplary German Expressionist films, they all kind of have a dark, moody, mystical quality. It's important to note that the core idea of Expressionism, which is that interior feelings express themselves in the exterior world, doesn't necessarily need to imply that those feelings are dark and anxious, but it tends to be the case that when we're talking about German Expressionism, those feelings are almost exclusively dark. And Eisner will talk about this. She says, mysticism and magic, the dark forces to which Germans have always been more than willing to commit themselves, had flourished in the face of death on the battlefields. That is, the battlefields of World War I. A new stimulus was thus given to the eternal attraction towards all that is obscure and undetermined, towards the kind of brooding, speculative reflection called Grübele, that is brooding, which culminated in the apocalyptic doctrine of Expressionism. So you don't have to accept Eisner's essentialism of the German people, which is sort of littered throughout her entire book. But all I want to pull out of this passage is the sense that if German Expressionism is inevitably tied to feelings spilling out of post-World War I Germany, it makes sense that German Expressionism is an almost exclusively dark cinematic movement, also full of mysticism and magic, flirtations with the supernatural. Hi folks, and welcome to our second video on German Expressionism. In this video, we're going to be talking about some of the influences that German Expressionism had on cinema that came after it. Remember, in the last video, we talked about two main things. First were some of the historical conditions of German Expressionism, and second, some of the aesthetic characteristics of German Expressionism. In this video, we're going to talk about movies that came after the movement that were influenced by it. So, German Expressionism is often understood to have a major influence on American filmmaking. And one of the reasons for that is in the 1930s, a lot of German filmmakers were fleeing Germany as Hitler and the Third Reich was coming into formation. Filmmakers like Fritz Lang, Billy Wilder, Edgar Ulmer, and many more would start to make films in the United States. And each of them would contribute to what's known as film noir, which is a Hollywood crime drama genre characterized by high contrast or low-key lighting, a cynical and or pessimistic worldview, and often adapted from hard-boiled detective fiction. So the main things that people tend to associate between German Expressionism and film noir is one, the emphasis on high contrast light and dark, high contrast shading and shadow, which you can see in this still from You Only Live Once by Fritz Lang, and Double Indemnity by Billy Wilder, and Detour by Edgar Ulmer, but also, again, that sense of German Expressionism's darkness, its pessimism, its dwelling in the darker aspects of humanity. Probably the other major film genre that was most notably influenced by German Expressionism is horror. In fact, some scholars think that the German Expressionist films like Dr. Caligari or Nosferatu are good candidates for some of the first horror films. In fact, there's even a book called Caligari's Children, the film as tale of terror, which is a history of the genre of horror, whose title really gives a lot of credit to the influence of German Expressionism on the genre that we call horror film. It's important to note that when scholars are talking about the influence of German Expressionism on film noir and horror, they're mostly talking about certain aspects of German Expressionism rather than others. Film scholar Kristen Thompson makes this point quite nicely in a blog entry on her website. She says, Hollywood films have seldom used distorted sets of this kind, that is, of the kind most notable in German Expressionist films. They appear occasionally, as in Son of Frankenstein. Most of the time, though, when people speak of expressionist style in films noir or horror films, they're talking about graphic effects created by lighting. So those lighting effects are what more or less define film noir, and they're some of the most immediately recognizable aspects of the mise-en-scène of horror films, which last till this day. And you can see that on display in a movie like Cat People, or even in this shot from Todd Browning's Dracula, which frankly looks a lot like the shot from Detour by Edgar Ulmer. Okay, but what about German Expressionism's contemporary influences? Probably there's one contemporary filmmaker most immediately associated with German Expressionism, and that's Tim Burton. And here it's quite clear that what we call the Tim Burton aesthetic is more or less an adapted version of German Expressionism. We can see that in his early short film, his short animated film called Vincent. We can see it in Batman and Batman Returns. We can see it in Edward Scissorhands quite prominently, in Beetlejuice, in Corpse Bride, in Dark Shadows. Tim Burton is quite clearly the filmmaker who is drawing an aesthetic connection to German Expressionism. While Tim Burton might be the biggest name associated with a very deliberate invocation of German Expressionist films in his movies, there are many other more recent films that are clearly and deliberately drawing on German Expressionism. For example, the fairly recent Macbeth film by one of the Coen brothers is one of the most German Expressionist films that we've seen in a long time. Many critics immediately noticed the aesthetic. Bill Desowitz said it cried out German Expressionism. And if you just look at some of the frames from the film, you can tell immediately through its framing, through its warped and extreme angles, its extreme high contrast, its use of sets that kind of defy ordinary architecture, and its general feeling of dread, that German Expressionism is all over this film. Another example is The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers. Critics also immediately noted the German Expressionist influence. Lee Marshall says, shot in an Expressionist black and white that harks back to cinema's earliest years, or referencing everything from German Expressionist cinema of the 1920s to U.S. silent comedy. Manohla Dargis says the film's more sustained pleasures, though, are its form and style, as presumptive influences von Stroheim's Greed and German Expressionism. Like the Macbeth film, The Lighthouse makes choices with cinematography that immediately recall the silent era. Notice the fairly narrow aspect ratio and the black and white. But beyond this, of course, The Lighthouse and Macbeth play to some of the thematic emphases of German Expressionism. Both are films that draw blurry lines between what is real and what is only imagined within a character's mind.
Is this a dagger which I see before me?
And they both leave you guessing as to the status of what you're seeing on screen, as how much it is inflected by the character's mindset or mood or emotion. But I don't want the discussion to end there, because you might say that German Expressionism's longer legacy is about a more diffuse aesthetic logic. Remember that express means to press out, to take emotions or feelings and kind of project them out into the world. Thomas Flight is a video essayist who has a video about German Expressionism and its larger influence on filmmaking in general. And I think he articulates this quite well. He says, Expressionism is a relatively simple idea.
Express interior experiences externally in the environment that surround the subject and in the style of the work itself.
He continues, from Apocalypse Now to Trainspotting,
there are many films where scenes or portions of the film seem to exist in a space that isn't quite reality, where the architecture, sets, lighting, and general atmosphere are heightened, and this heightening or shifting of reality is a reflection of the character's psychological experiences.
So Flight gives a pretty great example of this, though he doesn't dwell on it as long as I'd like him to. He looks at this very brief moment from the Orson Welles film Touch of Evil.
There's a single several-second shot from the Touch of Evil that I think about maybe more than any other shot in any movie. Here it is.
It's actually just a single shot that he's interested in. It's this one of the actor Welles, who plays a police detective, tilting his body to just narrowly avoid this steep structural part of the space's architecture. This is how Flight describes it. He says, there's nothing inherently unnatural happening in this shot. Nothing that actually defies physics, but it's sinister. The world seems to warp. It's like the wall is closing in. The physicality of what's happening in the shot feels like an expression of the terror of the character that's being approached. So I think this is a really good description of what's going on here. Remember that Kristen Thompson noted that most Hollywood films after German Expressionism would not give us deliberately exaggerated geometric sets like those of Caligari. However, if you look at this single shot, it uses ordinary and actual architecture, but it shoots it in such a way, and it has the actor manipulate his body in such a way, that it makes the architecture seem strange, imposing, warped. This moment when we're watching it doesn't feel deliberately choreographed in the way that Cesare's movements in Dr. Caligari feel choreographed. But when we think about the strangeness of how Orson Welles' body is moving against the environment, it absolutely is choreographed. And when we think about the fact that we can't see half of his face because it's shrouded in utter darkness, that also is choreographed. This kind of subtle expressionism, which draws on the darkness of German Expressionism, is something that we see all the time, but it's harder to notice. Another example along the same lines I want to look at is from the film Barton Fink by the Coen brothers. So Barton Fink is about a New York playwright who gets a chance to go to Los Angeles to see if he can make it big writing screenplays for movies. And one of the key locations in the film is a hotel where Barton Fink stays. And the hotel is shrouded in a kind of menacing darkness. Some critics have likened it to a kind of hell. And it's the ways that the hotel's darkness, its hellishness, is manifested on screen that I think is a good candidate for this film's expressionism. It's made clear in this film that it's incredibly hot in Los Angeles. And as a result, the cheap wallpaper starts to peel ever so slightly. It's something that could be played for laughs as a kind of ordinary nuisance, but this film makes it clear that the environment itself, the very materiality of the walls, has a sickness that is evocative of the mood of the character Barton Fink. And like the other two films that we looked at earlier, Barton Fink is a film that has so many instances where it's unclear whether what we're seeing is reality or whether what you're seeing is a projection of his interiority, of his mind. The fact that the film relies so much on these effects through mise-en-scène, again, is what makes this a great candidate for expressionism in contemporary cinema. So I do want to address a potential objection. Couldn't we say that this is just stylishness or formalism? In film studies, we sometimes have this binary between what's called formalism and realism as two general tendencies in film style. Realism wants to avoid all of the artifice that's attached to style, and formalism wants to use all the devices that cinema can give us to manipulate the world to achieve various aesthetic effects. Why are these things not just formalist or stylish, but also expressive, or rather expressionist? Well, Flight has actually a great answer to this question in his video essay. He says, often when a modern film or show uses expressionism as a technique, people say it's stylized or surreal. But you can be heavily stylized without being explicitly expressionist. And surrealism is its own unique way of bending or warping reality. Flight gives a very quick nod to what he means by being stylized without expressionist, and I think it's a perfect example. It's Wes Anderson. Wes Anderson's films are synonymous with stylish cinema, and he has a signature look that is immediately recognizable to anyone. But I think it would be wrong to call Wes Anderson an expressionist. Partly because the stylistic palette of Wes Anderson's films is more akin to a way of portraying a world rather than portraying a world inflected by emotion or mood. For example, in most of the images that you're looking at here, you're getting a kind of even, flat lighting. You don't get a lot of moody shadows in Anderson's films. And also, the performance styles of Wes Anderson's actors is fairly muted in emotion. Deadpan, as many call it. All of the hallmarks of expressionism, a kind of darkness, a moodiness, a way of taking the dark and moodiness of characters and putting it into the world, it's almost like Anderson's films are doing the opposite. And the last question I might ask following from the previous one is, so when are we seeing expressionism in particular rather than stylishness or formalism in general? Well, I think the simplest answer to this is to just go back to the aesthetic characteristics of German expressionism that we looked at earlier. First, we might ask, are the manipulations that of mise-en-scène? Or they have set design, lighting, costume, or makeup? It's generally understood that when you distort through camera effects and cinematography rather than mise-en-scène, you're participating in a tradition fostered by the French Impressionist filmmakers, not the German Expressionist filmmakers. Second is high contrast imagery, shadows, and silhouettes. You can of course have shadows and silhouettes and high contrast imagery without being expressionist. But if it's clear that those shadows and silhouettes and high contrast imagery are participating to a kind of moodiness and figurative darkness, then you might be in the realm of expressionism. And lastly, the dark and moody narrative and tone. I've seen some critics claim that movies like Amelie are good candidates for expressionism of the last 30 years, but I can see good reason to hesitate to make that categorization. The artistic movement of expressionism and the film movement of German expressionism tend to give us dark tones. And the sweetness and almost saccharine nature of a film like Amelie, which clearly warps reality in order to be attuned to the main character's subjectivity, might not be a good candidate for expressionism, but it's certainly something that's open for debate. Okay, and that's all I have for this second lecture on German expressionism and its influences. I'll see you next time. Hey folks, and welcome to our video on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This video is part of a series on German expressionism. We've already talked about the stylistic components of this film, but in this video we're going to focus a lot more on the plot and some of the canonical interpretations of the film. The film, once again, is the most famous film of the German expressionist movement. It was made in 1920 and it was directed by Robert Wiene. So here's a rundown of the plot of the film. The titular character, Dr. Caligari, is a traveling showman. His act involves using his sleepwalking assistant, Cesare, a man who's been asleep for 23 years. When Cesare is awoken by Caligari, he's able to answer any question and basically tell your fortune and see into the future. In attendance at this carnival act is our protagonist, Francis, and his friend, Alan. Alan asks Cesare how long he'll live, and Cesare replies, until dawn. That night, Alan is killed in his sleep by a shadowy figure that we soon learn was in fact Cesare himself. A number of other suspicious crimes then occur, and Francis is convinced that Caligari and Cesare must be behind them. After Cesare drops dead after a failed attempt to kill Francis's love interest, Jane, Francis catches Caligari slipping into the local insane asylum. He follows him into the insane asylum, runs into the asylum's director, and learns that it is in fact Caligari himself who runs the asylum. Francis manages to enlist the asylum staff to help him rifle through all of Caligari's stuff while he's asleep. They read his diary, and it's revealed that he's obsessed with a medieval Italian monk named Caligari, who learned the secrets of mind control. Our Caligari, who we learn just simply calls himself Caligari after the medieval monk, models himself after the monk and uses those hypnotism secrets to control one of his asylum inmates. The police are called, and Caligari thus winds up as an inmate in his very own asylum. Now, I've left out a very important detail of the plot that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but that is the overall plot structure of Caligari, and that's, I think, enough to get us to some of the core themes and concerns of the film. What is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari about? Well, remember the core historical conditions of German Expressionism. These films were made right after World War I. Germany was in social and economic disarray, and the most notable films of the German Expressionist period seem to reflect the turmoil of a post-war Germany. In particular, we might say, as many have, that the film Cabinet of Dr. Caligari stems from the disillusionment of World War I and the suspicion of authority. And in fact, if you look to the writers of the film, the writers of the script, Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayer, they have experiences that might lead them to a film that reflects the anxiety of a post-World War Germany, as well as a suspicion of authority. Janowitz himself served in the war and became a pacifist after his experience, while Mayer, according to some accounts, feigned madness to avoid military service, and some say that his military psychiatrist is the model for Caligari. I do want to say that some other sources say that this is an apocryphal story, almost too good to be true since it maps itself so perfectly onto the concerns of the film. But you'll find this story in most biographical accounts of Mayer. So how do we understand the film as reflecting a suspicion of authority? So I think it's pretty clear if you look at the central antagonists of the film, the ones doing the murdering. It's essentially a film about a hypnotist who abuses his power to make somebody mindlessly do his violent bidding. So we might say that Caligari stands in for authority in general, or perhaps the idea of a ruling class in general, and Cesare stands in for the common man. More specifically, you might say, as in fact the writers of the script have said countless times, that Caligari kind of stands in for the German government, and Cesare stands in for the common man who was conditioned to kill on behalf of the German government. In other words, that this is a story about World War I. Janowitz said, Caligari is about the authoritative power of an inhuman state gone mad. And it's not only about that power, but you might also say it's a condemnation of it. Near the end of the film, there's a kind of poetic justice in the fact that Caligari, the director of the insane asylum, who abuses his authority, is unmasked as insane himself. Or if not insane, calculatedly homicidal. So you might say that those in charge are unmasked as the truly insane. But here's where I want to introduce some of the tension, because this is not in fact how the film ends. The film begins with a frame narrative. Our protagonist, Francis, is sitting down telling this story that is the entire film to someone sitting next to him. And at the end of the film, it's revealed that Francis, who's telling us the story, is actually an inmate of Caligari's asylum. He may have made up the entire plot using his fellow inmates as characters. We see the woman he loves, and we see Cesare as fellow inmates. And then we see Dr. Caligari as the director of the asylum. So this framing device does a couple things to the story. In some sense, the idea that the story is coming from the mind of a madman is a sort of motivation for the famous, exaggerated and geometric set design of the film. Bordwell and Thompson actually mention this fact, saying that the subsequent films part of the German Expressionist movement would not necessarily motivate the exaggeratedness of their sets with such a device. They say, later, as Expressionism became an accepted style, filmmakers didn't motivate the style as the subjective state of mad characters. Instead, genre conventions were invoked. Expressionist design could create stylized imagery for fantasy and horror stories, as with Waxworks and Nosferatu, and films like The Nibelungen. But the second way in which the framing device changes the nature of the film is a bit more serious. Because in some sense it changes the film's entire attitude on authority. It goes from an indictment of authority almost to an endorsement of it. Caligari is no longer the villain. He's a professional caring for a madman who needs his help. You might say in this framing device, authority is necessary because some people need it, like our protagonist, Francis. What's really interesting is that the writers, Janowitz and Mayer, will come out and say that this twist ending was not their intention. It was forced upon them, they say. Janowitz says, quote, Meyer and I both expressed our dissatisfaction in a storm of thunderous remonstrances, heaped upon the guilty heads of the persons in charge of production and upon the absent director. So they're essentially saying that it's the director, Robert Vina, as well as other heads of production who are responsible for the framing device that they say changes the nature of. And here's where this notion of the framing device really matters to the history of the reception of this film. Dr. Caligari, one of the most important film thinkers of the 20th century, wrote a pretty famous book called From Caligari to Hitler. He says that the twist fundamentally changes the film. He says a revolutionary film was thus turned into a conformist one. He says, indeed, that the character Caligari stands for an unlimited authority that idolizes power as such and, to satisfy its lust for domination, ruthlessly violates all human rights and values. But, while the original story exposed the madness inherent in authority, Vina's Caligari, as opposed to the writer's Caligari, glorified authority and convicted its antagonist of madness. Krakauer continues, this change undoubtedly resulted not so much from Vina's personal predilections as from his instinctive submission to the necessities of the screen. Films, at least commercial films, are forced to answer to mass desires. So basically what he's saying here is that the film Caligari represents the latent desires of the German people to submit to absolute authority. Because interestingly, what results is a film in which you have a kind of fantasy of revealing the toxicity of authority, but it's only a fantasy. The reality of the film, suggests Krakauer, endorses the authority. Krakauer reads this as a kind of symptom of the German people's latent desire to submit to absolute authority. A very desire, he says, that would lead to the flourishing of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. That's why he titles the book From Caligari to Hitler. Caligari is a kind of Hitler figure for Krakauer, but more importantly, the existence of the film and the story within it reveals a kind of mass attitude about authority. So you might say that the first standard account, which says that Caligari is the German government and Cesare is a common man conditioned to kill, becomes a slightly different allegorical reading, where Caligari becomes Hitler and Cesare becomes the German people under the Third Reich. You might say that the standard reading is that the film is a symptom of World War I, and Krakauer's reading is that the film reveals attitudes and latent desires that would anticipate World War II, or more specifically, Hitler's power. And Krakauer's reading here doesn't just have thematic consequences, it also has consequences about the film's famous mise-en-scène. He says, as expressionist abstractions, the sets of this film were animated by the same revolutionary spirit that impelled the two scriptwriters to accuse authority, the kind of authority revered in Germany, of human excesses. He says, as expressionist abstractions, the sets were animated by the same revolutionary spirit that impelled the two scriptwriters to accuse authority, the kind of authority revered in Germany, of inhuman excess. However, Vina's version disavowed this revolutionary meaning of expressionist staging. In the film, expressionism seems to be nothing more than the adequate translation of a madman's fantasy into pictorial terms. In other words, for Krakauer, the framing device, which seemingly motivates the exaggerated, experimental, and geometric nature of the sets as being subjective expressions of a madman, saps those sets of their revolutionary implications. It gives them a sort of realistic explanation, as opposed to subverting the norms of how we represent space in cinema. At the same time, it's worth noting that Krakauer was still interested in the achievement of this film, especially its set design. He thinks the film is still very much about authority and tyranny, and that the set design has to do with that theme. He says the theme of tyranny with which the authors were obsessed pervades the screen from beginning to end. Swivel chairs of enormous height symbolize the superiority of the city officials turning on them, and similarly, the gigantic back of the chair in Alan's attic testifies to the invisible presence of powers that have their grip on him. Numerous steps ascend to police headquarters, and in the lunatic asylum itself, no less than parallel flights of stairs are called upon to mark Dr. Caligari's position at the top of the hierarchy. So Krakauer's position is not to say that this is merely a reactionary film, but rather that the film's revolutionary ambitions are presented as a fantasy that is suppressed by the film's reality, the reality that this is just a tale told by a madman. So it's worth noting here that a lot of critics have responded critically to Krakauer's account of this film, for a couple reasons. The first reason, which I don't want to get into too much, is that Krakauer insists that the screenwriters were making this completely revolutionary film, when the reality is that the original script of the film, which wasn't revealed until many decades later, also has a framing device that still somewhat renders the film's events as told through the mind of this character. He's not revealed to be a madman, but the film is still somewhat subjective. The second way that critics respond to Krakauer's reading is to sort of question the assumption that Krakauer is making about the twist. You might say, is this ending in the film really a completely unambiguous twist of events? If we look at this final few frames of the film, in which we kind of iris in on the face of Dr. Caligari, who is looking a bit cryptic, or at least his virtue as a source of comforting authority and sanity might be put in question, right? If the film ends this way, isn't it worth asking the question whether there's some ambiguity in the film? Whose truth is the truth that we should accept? A handful of major critics and film scholars have suggested that the film still bears an ambiguity that would mitigate Krakauer's reading. But regardless of how we respond to Krakauer's reading of the film, his way of reading this film, and in fact his way of reading many films from Germany in the 19-teens, the 20s, and the 30s, is extremely influential on the discipline of film studies. This is how Krakauer kind of presents his thesis for how he sees the relationship between film as a mass medium and society. He says the films of a nation reflect its mentality. What films reflect are not so much explicit credos as psychological dispositions, those deep layers of collective mentality which extend more or less below the dimension of consciousness. The idea that films or any form of mass media or mass communication reflect the unconscious desires or fears of a group of people would become extremely influential in film studies and would drive more or less what we call ideology critique. And in fact, Krakauer's insights about some of the most famous works from the Weimar era as reflecting anxieties about authority are super interesting and insightful. Each of these films, Nosferatu, Dr. Mabuse, Metropolis, The Golem, M, have at their core anxieties about authority and obedience. And the way that Krakauer weaves these films together to tell a story about the mass psyche of a nation on the verge of authoritarianism is super interesting. Krakauer writes, quote, "Whether intentionally or not, Caligari exposes the soul unwavering between tyranny and chaos and facing a desperate situation. Any escape from tyranny seems to throw it into a state of utter confusion." So once again, Krakauer was trying to diagnose a mass state of mind that desired authority because it feared chaos. So I want to end briefly by talking about some of Dr. Caligari's influences. We already talked about some of the influences that German Expressionism had on cinema. We talked about film noir and horror film, and Tim Burton, whose entire catalog of films is explicitly devoted to recreating a German Expressionist aesthetic. But I want to throw in one more filmmaker here, whose work I think nicely touches on some of the themes of Dr. Caligari, and that is Guillermo del Toro. Del Toro is often invoked as another major filmmaker who seems to be explicitly influenced by German Expressionism. His films don't look as on-the-nose expressionist as Tim Burton. They're interested in elaborate mise-en-scène, in very dark themes and dark tones, in monsters, and in blurred lines between reality and fantasy, all of which were shaped during the German Expressionist period. But more importantly, what I think ties Del Toro to German Expressionism, and more explicitly to Dr. Caligari and Krakauer's reading of the films of this period, is his anti-authoritarian and anti-fascist interests, which you can see in so many of his films. You can see it in The Industrialist in Kronos, you can see it in The Nazis in Hellboy, you can see it in his recent adaptation of Pinocchio, which takes the film to a new context of fascist Italy. You can see it in Pan's Labyrinth and The Devil's Backbone, two films which are set against the backdrop of the Spanish dictator Franco and the Spanish Civil War. These films are united by a common attribute of authoritarianism. And you can also link his anti-authoritarian and anti-fascist sentiment to his interest in otherness and the way that monsters tend to stand in for otherness. Del Toro is obsessed with monsters, but he's obsessed with depicting monsters as people who have been maligned by society. You can see this very clearly in The Shape of Water, and in Hellboy, and in Pinocchio, and also in Kronos. The notion of a fascist state expelling its state of impure people, of people who don't conform to an idea of a pure race, is I think how you connect Del Toro's interest in otherness and monsters as others with his anti-fascist sentiment. And one film in particular that you might look at as having a strong resonance with Caligari is a film like Pan's Labyrinth, which makes those themes of authority and obedience really explicit. It also blurs the line between fantasy and reality in a way that Caligari does as well. The story takes place during Spain during the summer of 1944, which is 5 years after the Spanish Civil War, during the early Francoist period. The narrative intertwines this real world with a mythical world centered on a labyrinth and a faun creature that the main character Ophelia interacts with. Her stepfather is a captain in Franco's regime, and he hunts down Spanish rebels who fight against Franco's regime in the forest nearby. So this film basically has two stories: a kind of gritty wartime tale of fascists versus rebels, and a fantastical tale in which Ophelia, the girl at the center of the narrative, goes on a kind of adventure and needs to complete a number of tasks at the beckoning of this magical faun creature. Where Caligari sort of stands in only metaphorically or allegorically for the German state, for the proto-fascist state, in Pan's Labyrinth we have an actual fascist who's standing in as the authority figure, and in Ophelia you have a disobedient subject. Throughout the film she is disobeying. And what's really interesting is that in her fantasy world, the faun is also an authority figure. And Ophelia is constantly disobeying him as well.
¡Entradme al niño!
No. Mi hermano se queda conmigo.
It's almost as if the magical world becomes a training ground for disobedience, for civil disobedience.
Obedecer. Así, sin pensarlo. Eso solo lo hacen gentes como usted, capitán.
And the way Del Toro talks about his filmography makes it very clear that he is thinking about these issues in his films. He says, much like fairy tales, there are two facets of horror. One is pro-institution, which is the most reprehensible type of fairy tale. Don't wander into the woods and always obey your parents. The other type of fairy tale is completely anarchic and anti-establishment. So you might say that what we have in Pan's Labyrinth is a film whose mise-en-scène, whose blurring of reality and fantasy, owes a lot to German Expressionism, but it takes another step further in connecting to some of the concerns that were at the heart of the film Dr. Caligari. Its concern with fascism and authority, and its interest in concocting a fairy tale not of obedience, of not wandering into the woods, but of the importance of disobedience. Okay, and that's all I have about Dr. Caligari. I'll see you next time.